listening to this presentation. I do want to make some quick comments here at the beginning, just so all of you are aware sort of how we're going to proceed. The original billing for this this webinar it looked more like it was going to be NEPSY and CMS and DKEFS last. But based on the information and the data that I had available to me, DKEFS has been promoted to be one of the more primary tools that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about NEPSY and CMS as well. The format, unfortunately, it was stated it was going to be a case study format, and it's really not a case study format. The format for this presentation is going to be sort of review of group data, and we will discuss sort of kind of the key issues when doing evaluations using these particular tools for children who have had brain injury. And when we, kind of initially, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the research and background information to give us some sort of clues or provide some basic background that will help us when we go to think about our evaluations and what we would like to do in our evaluation. Okay, so we're going to just talk about some general overview, looking at some of the cognitive effects that we expect in children who have had a traumatic brain injury. And one thing that's very clear from all the research is that there is no one single profile. You're not going to say, okay, a child has had a brain injury, therefore we know that they're going to have problems with attention or problems with memory or problems with executive functioning. If that were true, there would be no reason to do any testing. We would just know that they had these problems. There's a lot of variability in part due to, one, the severity of injury, and from the research we know that the more severe the injury, the more global the deficits are going to be, the more significant the deficits are going to be, and the worse the outcomes tend to be. Another key piece of information is what the child's level of premorbid functioning was. Is this a child who is failing all their courses already, or is this a child who's a straight-A student? Do we know what their general intellectual ability was before they were injured? What was their behavior like before they were injured? All these play an important role in the outcomes. And, of course, the location of the brain injury. Typically, when we think of brain injury, we think of closed head injuries, like you sustain in a car accident where you hit the front of your head on an object, and those typically result in specific types of injury in terms of the parts of the brain involved. However, in most injuries, there is some global brain injury due to the brain moving back and forth and shearing and all those forces. And when we have a closed head injury versus an open head injury, there's even more variability in the open head injury because it could be a very specific injury resulting in a skull fracture and damage to a very specific part of the brain, or it could be much more global damage as well. And another issue that needs to be considered is the age at which the child was injured. So children who are much younger may have more chance of more brain plasticity and recovery, but the impact may be worse in a more severe injury. So there's a lot of factors that affect the outcome. Now, the cognitive deficits experienced after TBI are not unique to TBI. This is another issue in terms of, can you use tests to say, yes, this child's had a brain injury versus this child has not had a brain injury. You really can't do that because a lot of other disorders have similar cognitive problems. So you might look at a child as attention deficit disorder. They have problems with executive function. They have difficulties with being forgetful. They have problems in controlling their behavior. Children who have epilepsy may have problems with their memory. They have difficulties recalling things that they're supposed to remember. So you can't use tests per se to say, oh, this child has had this injury versus that injury, or this developmental disorder or that developmental disorder. But the tests help us understand for that individual child what their strengths and weaknesses are. So you may see some changes in mood. You may see changes in social functioning. You might have kids with very subtle language deficits and you might not even realize that they're having problems understanding or communicating, but it does have an impact on their social functioning. And oftentimes there are academic difficulties when there may not have been previously. One of the big things that we're going to see from the research is that the long-term outcomes are often related to how the family functions, both pre-morbidly and after the injury. Now, the injury itself, you get primary damage at the site where, the person hit their head or something penetrated, and you'll often get additional damage that's related to the head shifting back and forth. So the contracture site is on the other side of the brain, where the brain slams up against the cranial vault and then shakes back and forth. And depending upon the force at which the person is hit, that can be minimal damage or it could be rather significant. So if they're hit in the forehead, you're going to see some frontal lobe damage in the front, and as well as the parietal or occipital damage in the posterior portions of the brain. More critically are secondary sources of damage, and this is loss of oxygen to specific parts of the brain due to bleeding, loss of blood in that area. In particular, the hippocampus, or the memory part of the brain, is really vulnerable to hypoxic damage. You also have loss of blood flow due to arterial hypertension, and then on top of that you can have brain swelling and bleeding, which leads to an increase in intracranial pressure. And we know that an increase in intracranial pressure right after the injury has a really big impact on the short and long-term outcomes. And any hemorrhaging as well will have a big impact. So just at the time of the injury, there are many factors that, if they're well controlled by the medical team, can have a big impact on whether or not the child will have longer-term or shorter-term disability, how their cognitive functioning will be. Some epidemiological data shows that an incidence of TBIs resulting in hospitalization or death, and this was a study done in Minnesota, that the incident rate is about 73 in 100,000, which seems relatively small, and that's because they're not really including sort of what we would call more milder concussive injuries that maybe you see on a more regular basis that you have in sports concussions and those kind of things. This is where the person would end up being hospitalized or there was some kind of severe injury. Of those, 9 in 100,000 resulted in death. Most were discharged, and the average length of stay were 2 days. So these are, probably moderate injuries. They're in the hospital for a few days. They're sent back home. Of course, if the injury is more severe, many of them will have to go to a rehabilitation hospital. And of the severe cases, many will not make it. They will die, and many of those will also have disability. So it's like a repeated slide, sorry. Cognitive deficits that are often experienced by children after a traumatic brain injury include deficits in executive functioning. We'll talk about that more later. Attention and concentration, processing speed, working memory, social cognition. Now, of all of these, probably working memory is the one that ends up being most intact, but it depends on how you assess that skill. A variety of deficits associated with pediatric TBI, they're going to vary. So not every kid's going to have, I'm going to have executive function deficits, attention deficits, and social cognition deficits, and memory deficits. You might have some areas that are intact or are strengths, and those can be used to help facilitate the person's recovery, or at least their functioning in other domains. Now, there's a really nice review in the journal Neuropsychology, and this is a meta-analysis looking at a whole bunch of studies across, different groups, but focusing in on mild, moderate, and severe traumatic brain injury. And I present these to you just with the understanding of, what kinds of effects that we're really talking about, like how big of a problem may a child experience. One of the areas, of course, that's of concern is any changes in intellectual functioning, and this is usually, in the studies measured by a WIS score, like a DAS or those kinds of instruments. And the impact of a mild injury, you see less than 0.3 of an effect size. Now, an effect size is really just the standard deviation of the difference between the clinical group and the comparison group. And that would be equivalent to if you were looking at a Wechsler scale with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15, that might be like 5 points. That would be like going from 100 to a 95. Now, if you think about a moderate injury, the effect sizes are more like 0.5 or 0.6. And again, if you're looking at a Wechsler scale, you're looking up to 9 points different. So you may have lost, from 100 down to a 91. In more severe cases, you can have some pretty significant deficits in intellectual functioning up to an effect size of 1 or greater than 1. And then you're looking more like 15 points. So if the person had an IQ of 100 initially, they're now functioning at a level of 85. It does vary somewhat between verbal comprehension, sort of verbal problem-solving skills, and perceptual reasoning skills with, very similar for mild and moderate, more effects on verbal processing than perceptual reasoning processing, at least in this meta-analysis for the severe group. However, you'll see that they're very close, and those differences are negligible. Another concern that we have after brain injury, and this is probably one of the more sensitive measures, if you think about it as not a global measure like IQ is, but as more of a specific cognitive function, processing speed is a really important area in terms of evaluation. Even in mild injuries, you see the effects are a little bit larger. You might knock off, on a Wechsler scale, it might be, 4 or 5 points off. And for moderate injuries, again, you're looking at more like 9 to 10 points off. And for severe injuries, almost up to 12 to 15 points off their previous level. You might have had, processing speed in the average range, nice 100, and then after your injury, you're down in the middle to low 80s. And that has a big impact. And we'll see that this is an important concept because many of the tests that we use to measure other abilities are also tapping cognitive constructs that we've just talked about. So you have verbal abilities, you have perceptual abilities, and you have processing speed. If I'm going to measure executive functioning, say with a verbal skill, I have to consider that their language skills may have been impacted by the injury as well. So teasing out what is an impairment in executive functioning versus an impairment, say, in language or the more basic contextual skill is a challenge that we face as clinicians. You see here with working memory deficits, the effect sizes are a little bit smaller. In fact, very small for mild injuries, moderate, again, even still a very small effect size, and very small to moderate effects for even severe injuries. So at a 0.4 or 0.5 effect size, if you're looking at a Wechsler scale, you're looking at, maybe 6, 7 points lower than they were previously. Other areas of interest, attention, again, we'll see effect sizes around 0.6, 0.7. Those are moderate effect sizes, and that, again, is going to depend on how you measure it. This is typically looking at continuous performance tests like the Connors or something like that. Fluency, this is usually measured by a verbal fluency task, and we'll talk about the DKEFS verbal fluency in a little bit. But it just asks the person to, to say as many words as they can that begin with a certain letter or from a certain category. Here we see rather large effects for severe and much more than in other domains. And one thing I wanted to mention here is that by each of these, it says long-term next to it. It says attention deficits, pediatric TBI, long-term. Long-term means that these are deficits that are still seen 24 months after the injury. So we're not talking about, okay, they just got injured and we're testing them, 3 months later. We're talking that these are deficits that are long-term. They're not fully recovering necessarily from the injury in these domains. And you'll see fluency has rather big effects. Inhibition, you'll see pretty similar results between moderate and severe. They're not as large as other cognitive domains, much like attention. Problem solving is reduced about the same, and visual perceptual skills are not as severely as affected as some other areas. Verbal memory. When you think about verbal memory, you need to think about when the person is responding to the information you provide for them. So, for example, if I read a story to you and tell you to say it back to me right after I've said it to you, that's considered immediate memory. And if I say to you, well, I want you to tell me that story that you heard 30 minutes ago, that would be considered delayed memory. And you have differences in terms of presentation. I could say, tell me the story exactly as you heard it and expect you to make a verbal response. Or I could say, I'm going to ask you questions about that story. Did this or that happen? Yes or no? Did this or this happen? Yes or no? That will be considered a recognition trial. So there are different ways of slicing memory, and we can talk about that more when we look at the CMS. And those have different meaning in terms of the child's performance and meaning in terms of what the nature of the deficit is. Now, in verbal memory, what you see is about a half a standard deviation impairment in the severe group for immediate recall. And part of the reason why that's not larger is because when you give someone immediate recall measures, you're also getting working memory helping that function. So as I'm reading the story to the person, they're storing some of that information in their mind. It's not having to go into long-term memory. They spit that back out, and then they're able to get more from long-term memory. But later on, when you go to the long-term trial, that information is no longer working memory. They have to pull everything out of their long-term stores. And that's why you get a larger effect on delayed for the severe group. And that's closer, almost a 1.0, close to 1 effect size. Visual memory, you see it's not as significant of an effect. Well, it's pretty similar, I should say. I'm sorry. It's pretty similar for visual as it is for delayed, where visual immediate is about half standard deviation and about a standard deviation down for the delayed recall. It's very, I want to say now, it's very difficult to measure the construct of visual memory, and you'll get a lot of variability between tests. So some tests that are out there don't even have visual delayed memory. Some do have visual delayed memory. Of course, the CMS and the NEPSY both have delayed visual memory and immediate memory. One thing that came up in the research study, and a lot of people will, being a research director in the position I'm in, I hear a lot about what people like or don't like about tests. And oftentimes I'll hear people say, well, the norms are soft, or, everybody does okay on it. The thing to keep in mind is that a lot of research studies that are doing, this kind of work are using matched control groups. And in matched control groups mean if I have a lot of children whose parents are highly educated, those kids have higher premorbid function in general. So I match them against kids who also have higher premorbid functioning because their parents are also have a high degree of education, a lot of money, or however you want to match them. And you'll say, oh, look, the difference is about 1 standard deviation between those two, or maybe even larger. But then when you apply it to population means, you don't necessarily get a 1-to-1 correspondence. That's because in the population, you have people whose premorbid abilities are all over the place. Some were very good to begin with, some were not very good to begin with. And you now are being compared not just to people who have similar backgrounds or similar abilities. You're comparing now to people who maybe were very low functioning, but they were still normal, didn't have a brain injury. So the normative data might look like, oh, well, their scores are average or low average, they're fine, is not necessarily indicative of what their loss of ability was, what their change in ability was. So they used to be maybe high average, and now they're average. That's a big drop. I know someone already asked about about estimating premorbid functioning, and I mean, it's extremely important, and we just don't have the tools that we have in kids right now that we do in adults. It doesn't mean we're not working towards that, and I think what you'll probably be seeing in the future is a dedicated effort, on our part at least, to providing some way to estimate these abilities. Right now, I think most people function based on looking at previous grades or academic performance. Maybe they had, like an OLSAT or, something like that would give you some estimation of what their ability was. You can look at some demographic factors. And we did do a paper for the NEPSY. This was not published in a journal. We did it for a conference where we do have education adjustments for parent education, which is kind of like a way of doing a match control for an individual rather than a group. Now, some of the research that we were talking about. This is an article done by Jerry Taylor. If you got to look up if you're interested in any research. Jerry Taylor does really great work. He does a lot of longitudinal studies, does perspective studies. He's done a lot of great work. But when you look for his name, he goes by Jerry, and he's listed as HG. I'm not sure what his H is, but I know he goes by Jerry personally, but HG in his research. And he showed that the severity of injury and family environment have a big influence on post-injury school readiness. So when they were looking at school readiness, they found that the kids, of course, who had more severe injuries were clearly not ready to be starting school. And when the family environment was not conducive to organizing and helping the child adjust, they had even bigger problems. Another study that showed children who's had injuries at ages 2 to 6 that their adaptive and their behavioral outcomes were associated, again, with injury severity and also their premorbid abilities. So if you had kids who were delayed, they continued to be delayed. If you had kids who were, further along in their adaptive skills, they tended to be ahead of the kids who, were delayed initially within the same severity group. So you have two kids with severe injuries. The kid who was ahead on their developmental milestones already is still going to be ahead of the kid who was behind. The kid who had behavior problems before the injury is going to be more susceptible to having behavior problems both after the injury and associated with the injury. There's studies showing that African American children tend to have worse functional outcomes after pediatric TBI, and this was a very large database that they got this from, and in part, it wasn't clear as to why they had more, but they seemed to be more at risk after the injury for the long-term outcomes, and perhaps they might need more resources from the school or from whatever resources are available. Also, kids who came from lower socioeconomic status, they also had worse functional outcomes after brain injury. So again, the kids who are at risk and then they have an injury are going to be even at a higher risk, and they're the kids we really need to watch out for and to give them as much support as we can after they've had this kind of problem. The social outcomes of kids after brain injury are associated with deficits in executive functioning, pragmatic language skills, and if you're not aware what pragmatic language skills are, it's just sort of like the rules of using language. How close do you stand to someone? Do you talk first? Do you talk? How the things that people learn, that almost like meta rules of language, and social problem-solving skills. So the ability to understand how you should go about a certain relationship or solve problems within a relationship was important into their overall social outcomes. Often kids who are going to have behavior problems will have those problems emerge within the first year. So you're going to see earlier rather than later if there's a problem with behavior. It's, again, associated with severity of the injury, coming from a lower socioeconomic environment, having premorbid behavior problems, also concurrent issues such as poor working memory skills, poor social skills, low school competence, and poor family outcomes. So you have a combination of factors here. Again, kids who had difficulties to begin with are more likely to have problems later. Kids who, after their injury, are having problems with their social skills or with their memory skills or with their school competence, those kids are going to be at risk for problems long term. Another thing to consider is that when the child with the injury has behavior problems, it has a big impact on the relationship of that child with other kids in the family, and it also will impact the way the other children in the family are behaving and could result in more behavior problems and more stress for the family. Parent psychological distress and perceived family burden and their coping skills have a big impact on long-term outcomes. And Keith Yates is another person who's done a lot of really good work in this area. If you look up any of his research, again, a lot of longitudinal studies, a lot of prospective studies, those kind of things. Injury will have a long-term effect on the child's academic and their behavior, but it's moderated by the family environment. So, and I keep bringing this up because it's part of our evaluation that the child themselves is not the only source what we need to consider in terms of evaluation and in terms of intervention. Helping the family adapt to the injury will be as important to the child's long-term functioning as helping them with their day-to-day cognitive problems. So studies show that parents' acceptance of the injury, they had lower stress than parents who would deny the impact of the injury. Those who had active coping styles tend to be more stressed out than those who were more humored and laid back about problems. There are some web-based family interventions that have been getting some attention. We did some, I didn't personally do this, but I worked with some folks who were did something called a cognitive prosthetics. And a cognitive prosthetic was simply having the injured person have access to computer or electronic devices where a therapist could check in with them on a regular basis to make sure that they were doing the things that they were supposed to do, get to their appointments, if they had employment, making sure that things were going well with the person in terms of their employment situation and their financial situation. And we're going to see in the next few slides how this is important in terms of outcomes. And although it's based on adult research, I think we can glean a lot in terms of its application for children as well. So if you look at the Colantonio study, looked at a very large sample of individuals with brain injury a very long time after their injury, is on average, mostly they had impairments in executive functionings and in memory functioning. Only 29% were actually working at the time of the injury compared to 64% of them. So this is 7 to 24 years later. They haven't recovered enough in order to go back to work. So what does that mean? It means that they need a lot of services. That means they need support. They need disability, both financial and possibly help with daily activities. They have a lot of other health problems related to cognitive injury. The biggest problems that they have were doing simple things like shopping, managing money, transportation. So the things I was telling you about this cognitive prosthetics, it was really to help them with the day-to-day living. Think about that for kids. what is that like for kids? Well, they're going to school, and they have to manage, getting to class on time. They have to manage following the rules in class. They have to get along with their peers. They have to, if they're having a problem, they have to be able to tell someone that there's a problem going on. They have to be able to do their homework. They have to be able to get home and do their chores if they have chores, and all these things that, are the adaptive functions that are expected of children. And if we anticipate they going to have problems in these areas, we have to figure out ways of managing that. A lot of problems with community reintegration, and of course these are with adults, although they would rate social integration as one of their better areas, that isn't often true in some of the research that we've seen. So returning to competitive employment after brain injury is related to intellectual functioning on initial exam and post-acute exam. So this is important in terms of when we're evaluating children. We know that the kids who are more impaired right after the injury, they're going to recover some function. But if they're really, really impaired, in this study they said those who initially had, IQs in the 70s and 80s when they were first evaluated, they may not gain enough in order to be able to be functional and get back to work. So we can have a good sense of when, we get information about what their functioning was after the injury to say, well, gee, this is a kid we need to really put resources around and really help them out because they're going to really struggle. Oftentimes, neuropsychological test scores were better in the group returning to work. So if you see kids with significant memory problems with attention, executive functioning, again, those kids are going to struggle more in terms of getting back to their functional level than those with better skills. Those who had higher levels of that's not important. Oftentimes, after 2 years, some individuals with injuries continue to have worse outcomes. It means that they declined. They didn't get better. So a percentage of individuals, you're going to say, okay, we know they've had an injury, okay, they're getting better, they're doing fine, they may not be where they were at before, but they're doing better, this is great. Some kids will stay about the same level after their injury. They don't really get better, but they don't really lose. Some are going to decline their abilities. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's the severity of the initial injury, and they're just not, progressing developmentally. But we can expect that some kids are just going to get further and further down. And those who tended to get services tend to have really low scores, and it took a long time in this study for them to get that. So the take-home message there is that, it's important to intervene as quickly as possible, of course not immediately after the injury because they need recovery, but to provide services sooner rather than later. And one of the things that they found is that, those people who they did get services to were more likely to go back to work. And there was a tendency to serve people who were only severely injured so that people who had more moderate injuries didn't get any services, and then it turned out that they didn't do as well because they didn't get anything to help them out. So even though someone's had maybe more of a moderate injury and has only declined a little bit from their premorbid level, it's still important to provide services for that individual, even though they might look like, well, their IQ's okay, it's like 95, or, their cognitive scores are okay, they're sort of low average, maybe even, on the upper end of the average range. Well, those kids might still need some services, and, you can still expect to see maybe a kid who was a straight-A student struggle. And it won't be obvious from their test scores why they're struggling, but it will be obvious from their behavior why they're struggling. One of the issues that kids are going to struggle with, as well as adults after an injury, is just being aware that they have impairments. So if they're not recognizing that they're having problems with, say, social perception or, memory functioning, then they're not going to know either when to get help or to use some kind of aids to help them. They're also going to be, not aware of the impact of their behavior on others, which is typical of kids anyway, so it could be even worse. some of these other things we've already talked about. Length of PTA is how long they had post-traumatic amnesia, and their initial injury level really differentiated who could go back to work and who didn't. Same thing's going to be true with kids. The kids who are most impaired are going to have more difficulty getting back to school. Let's see. Many of the people who do have severe injuries are able to go back to productive employment if sufficient and appropriate effort is invested into helping them. So if you have the resources available, I know when I was practicing here in Delaware, we had RAP services where we could go out and help families, not actually with brain injury, but kids who had some significant disabilities, help them in the home, help them, manage the child in terms of, school and home and that interaction and those things. So if you have RAP services available, that's helpful. And again, doing some rehab strategies with them in terms of helping them with their memory and executive functioning and social emotional issues will be very important in terms of their adjustment back to the school setting. So early referrals, again, they often have more physical and cognitive limitations, but obtain better results because they're getting the services. That was when I was mentioning about not forgetting the kids who are more moderately impaired. And if you control for all these background variables in terms of SES and premorbidability, you still find that deficits in executive functioning, social communication, in this case it was measuring affect perception, so can you tell happy, sad, neutral faces, those predict not only occupational outcomes in adults, but also their social integration. So you can see that applying that for children, if you have kids with rather significant executive functioning problems, they're going to have some difficulties adapting to getting their schoolwork done and relating to others. Having problems with social perception, such as affect recognition or theory of mind or those types of tasks, may interfere with their ability to relate to their peers in a way that they did in the past. And in particular, kids who were weak in these areas to begin with, it could create even more significant problems. Working memory and executive functioning also predicted ability for daily living skills in these adults. So it's important to really measure these constructs so you can help figure out who's really at risk and maybe in what areas they are at risk. And this slide is actually a little bit out of order. It should come to you later. But one of the biggest problems we face in doing evaluations as clinicians is to decide, is this kid got an impairment of some kind? Do they have a deficit? Do they have a weakness? Is this really a problem? And we don't necessarily, I don't have an answer in that there's one number that you say, this number means that the person needs services or don't need services. This number means they have an impairment or they don't need impairment. It really is dependent upon a lot of factors, including their premorbid level of functioning and those types of things. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that when you have people with mild to moderate disabilities, they are not going to score in the scaled score range of, if you're looking at Wechsler subtests, of the 3s and 4s and 5s. It's not typical. Can happen because anybody can get scores down there. But when you look at, say, mild MR, and this is when we have their subtest scores on the Wechsler. This is a test to differentiate people who are mentally retarded from those who are not. Their subtest scores range from 3.8 to 6.2. So as a group, there are some kids, on cancellation that are getting not well above 6.2, which means they're getting 7s and 8s. And they're still MR, okay? They're getting well below that also. Or if you think about standard tests like arithmetic, where that was their lowest score, that's the average, 3.8, it's almost 4. So you think there's kids who are mentally retarded, they're getting 5, 6, and 7 on these subtests. Does it mean they're not MR? No, it doesn't mean they're not MR. It just means that in this particular test, their scale score happened to be, say, maybe low average, not impaired. And you have to look at their scores as a whole rather than any single one. Now, so what that means is if you're dealing with kids who have had brain injury, so you look at, the effect sizes that we were talking about earlier. I mean, for mild, you're going to get scores in average around, 9s on scaled score and in the mid-90s for your index scores. If you think about for moderate injuries, you're looking at effect size around 0.5 to 0.7. That you're looking at the subtest level, scale scores around 8. And for more severe injuries, then you start to look for effect size around 0.8 to 0.1, and that puts you in the, like around the 7 to 8 range. So you're not, this is as a group. So if your average score for a particular ability in a moderate to severe brain injury group is a scale score of 8, that means a lot of kids are getting scores higher than 8, and a lot of kids are getting scores lower than 8, which makes it a challenge to say, well, okay, then, they must not have had a brain injury because they got, a 10. It's not it at all. It just means that on that particular skill, compared to a population norm, they're at the 50th percentile. However, at one time, they might have been at the 75th percentile. It's hard to say. Okay. We don't running a little fast on time here, so I'm going to move on to our DKEFS overview. Now, the DKEFS has been around since 2001, and it came to fruition after about 10 years of development. Our authors are Dean Delis, of course, Edith Kaplan, and Joel Kramer. It consists of 9 standalone tests of executive functioning, and is normed on a sample of ages 8 to 89. The overall design philosophy is that executive functioning is measured within a context. And actually, I want to say it's not just executive functioning, but all skills are measured within a context. And that means, if I'm looking at executive functioning, it could be using verbal material. It could be using visual material. So if the person has a deficit in one of those underlying skills, I have to consider that in order to determine if truly the deficit is an executive function problem or if it's due to the precursor skill. And I want to say that NEPSY is kind of similar in terms of the developmental philosophy in terms of that you're measuring things within a context. And it's also assumed that you'll need multiple scores to understand if there's an executive functioning problem or not. So, of course, executive functionings are higher order cognitive skills that allow for the individual to engage in independent goal-directed behavior. Impairments in executive functioning have been associated with damage to frontal lobes or frontal subcortical networks. So you could have a person who's had damage in the basal ganglia and have a pure frontal syndrome because those are connections because that area of the brain is highly connected to the frontal lobes and is very important for behavioral regulation, probably as much as the frontal lobes themselves are. Now, executive functioning deficits can produce very obvious behavior problems that you're going to say, whoa, that person's really way out of there. They're really not doing what they need to be doing, to much more subtle problems with behavioral control, and you then that kind of, you somewhat question if it's a motivational thing. Oh, they're doing it on purpose. They're really not impaired. Look, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's just a personality issue. And the thing that's so important about executive functioning, it relates to a lot of the things that we think about as personality. Behavioral. The person is they behave themselves, or they a person who's sensation-seeking and risk-taking versus not so. Is it a person who's good at relating to people, interacting with them in terms of understanding how to regulate that relationship, and all those things that are much more higher level rather than some of the basic stuff. Of course, we're concerned about mental flexibility. Can the person think about problems in more than one way? Set formation is, do they understand what the rules of the task are? Can they maintain those and understand them? Can they initiate their behavior? Can they just get going? And we see this a lot with ADHD kids. They just can't seem to get going or get to work on things that they need to do. How productive are they? Can they keep working on things even if they're not, that interesting? Can they monitor themselves to, oh, I made a mistake on this, I better fix it? Can I, monitor, like, oh, I'm on my way to do X task, and on the way, 5 things distract me, and I never end up doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Oh, I'm supposed to be, going up to do my homework, and on the way, I decide to pet the cat. I'm going to the bathroom. 5 minutes later, I'm downstairs watching TV. You can't monitor themselves or making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Abstract reasoning, can they think about things more than in a concrete way? Inhibition, impulsive/prepotent response. So a prepotent response is essentially something that kind of comes to you automatically, that you're going to respond this way in a certain situation, kind of prep to act that way. Can you inhibit that when it's appropriate to do so? Can you learn the rules of a task, either implicit or explicit rules, and apply those? And that's really important because many of the rules, especially social rules that we live by, are not explicit. They're very implicit. If I can't pick those up or understand those, my behavior is going to seem, out of sorts. It's not going to follow along with what's supposed to be doing. And even if I know the rules, so I'll say the teacher says, oh, there's no talking in class, okay? I might know that rule, but am I able to apply it? Am I able to, in that situation, say, okay, I want to talk to Johnny here, but it's against the rules, so I better not. I mean, if I am impulsive and can't monitor myself, I might just start talking to Johnny, and the teacher says, don't you know you're not supposed to talk in class? And you go, well, yeah, and you've already broken the rule. So it's an application problem. So we're concerned about their problem-solving ability, creative thinking, fluent thinking. Can they keep up an idea and a concept? Can they process multiple pieces of information at the same time? Can they plan their behavior? Can they organize their environment? Can they inhibit old patterns of behavior? Are they disinhibited? Do they lack control? Are they perseverative? Do they keep saying the same things and doing the same things, even though you've corrected them 1,000 times? Johnny, you're not supposed to talk in class. Oh, yeah, I remember, teacher. Sorry. Oh, Johnny, you're not supposed to talk in class. Oh, sorry. So they keep doing the same things, even though they know better. Forgetfulness. They're off task when they're supposed to be doing something else. They forget why they're doing stuff. They lose track of what's going on. They're a big thing, and it's one of the things that I like to look for, is inefficiency. So what often you'll see is a kid who's putting forth a lot of effort, but they're not getting anything done. Okay, I'm working, and what you turn in is so poorly done or ineffectively done that you might as well not have done it. They also maybe have difficulty understanding consequences and cause-effect relationships. They don't necessarily put 2 and 2 together. Okay, I decided to go out and be with my friends last night. Therefore, time got away from me and I didn't get my homework done, and that's why I'm failing class. They're not putting it all together that, gee, I shouldn't go out with my friends in the evening because that's interfering with my ability to meet my goals. The big thing is frequently knowing what the rules are, but violating them anyway. So you can ask the child, what the rule is that they violated. They'll be able to tell it to you, but they do it anyway. So it seems willful. And it ain't necessarily. Kids might appear apathetic. They lack motivation. They don't get going. Even if you prod them, say, come on, get this done, get this done. Like, yeah, I'm going to do it, and nothing gets done. And all these are cognitive skills. We think about them, they seem like personality. They seem like this is, part of what makes us who we are, but they're really skills. It's no different than having a learning disability. If I have a problem learning to read, people kind of understand that. Oh, it's a disability. But I have a problem learning how to behave or controlling my behavior. Wait a second, that's you're just not motivated. Okay, so again, this is kind of more of what we've already been talking about. It's problems with judgment then, problems coping with change. That's a big issue. And the reason I'm putting all these things out here is really, as clinicians, we have to think about ahead of time for the people who are going to be working with this child or this adolescent, what problems can they anticipate that this person will have? How can they structure the environment to allow the child to, function as best as they're able to. And so that they understand ahead of time as well, too, that, he's going to know the rules and he's not going to follow them all the time. But you have to have a plan in place for how to appropriately correct them and how to, get them to follow the rules better. You anticipate some, things that might set them off in terms of, being emotionally, unstable, problems with frustration tolerance, and those kind of things. And the way we understand, if someone's having, kind of a behavior issue is that, one, is the behavior or the emotional response appropriate to the context? We oftentimes can't tell that with kids. A lot of times there's a lot of provocation at the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that we're not aware of. If we just see a kid acting out, if we don't understand why that's happening, we could be assuming that the person's behavior is driven solely by their own desire. And it's especially bad with kids who have problems with cognitive control. They often are targeted, and they are set off because kids know they can do it. Is the response appropriate? So is it overly intense? Is it, violating some explicit or implicit rule? Understanding those things that, okay, going back to the kid, like, okay, yeah, I understand you were upset in the situation, but, throwing the pencils at people or, flipping the desk and that, we're going to have to work with you on how to make this something that's more appropriate when you're angry. It's all the things we do anyway as clinicians, but, in this case, we're likely to see a little more volatility. We're apt to see a lot more apathy, problems with maintaining focus and attention and, staying on task. We got to look for the external catalysts. If the kid's really distracting in a particular classroom, they're not getting anything done, we have to look at why that is. We have to, decide if the outcome of their behavior is actually leading to some secondary gain. Were there any alternative solutions? And, what is that kid's social standing, behavioral history? So all these things that help us understand whether the impact that their cognitive deficits are having on their social environment. They're impacting their social environment, but they're also being impacted by the social environment, and they can't regulate that, and therefore they're more likely to act in a way that's inappropriate. So we have to look for both their own social background and the social environment. We must anticipate that they're going to be very inconsistent in the way they interact with the world, because it's just the nature of the injury. All this allows us to help people interpret the child's behavior better. Can't assume intent if it's a cognitive problem. Can't assume that the child's aware of available options if there are any, and we have to be able to provide those for them. They may not look obviously cognitive limited, but they might be. And in fact, a lot of the kids, when we did our NEPSY study of kids who were classified as emotionally disturbed, all those kids had pretty significant cognitive problems. Primarily, they had poor language skills and poor executive functioning. These are pretty significant problems when you're talking about relating to people and maintaining your behavior in a rather strict or rigid environment. Knowing the rules versus being able to apply the rules are two different things. So you can say, does this kid know right from wrong? Doesn't matter if they know right from wrong. Do they know, can they apply that? Can they apply it in the situation? How can you help them apply that knowledge when they have a tendency to not be able to do that? How is your response going to be? Are you going to be more punitive or accommodative? It has to be understood that, the impact of one versus the other will be very different, and the nature of what the child will respond to, all those kind of things. Now, what we're going to do assessment of executive functions, and the reason I want to focus so much on executive function is because it's really hugely important in terms of what the research says about the children's ability to adapt after an injury is highly related to both their executive functioning and also to some of their social cognition. I'd like to spend time on social cognition, but I don't have the data on that, so we're going to focus mostly on executive function. Now, when we're assessing it, again, we're going to look at the impact of other domains, attention, language, visual spatial skills, motor, memory, those kind of things. We have to understand that the test rules themselves create what's called a cognitive set. So if you were to compare design fluency on the NEPSY versus design fluency on the DKEFS, You might say, well, they're both the same test, we're going to get the same results. No, they're not the same test at all, and you're going to get very different results. And how they're different is in the rules of the test. The DKEFS version has a lot of rules. Use 4 lines. Make sure they're straight. Make sure you only touch the dark circles or the light circles, depending on what it is. Make sure that your designs don't repeat. So there's a series of rules that they have to follow. That creates the set. You have to use the 4 lines. Whereas in NEPSY, it's like, well, you can use 2, 3, 4 lines, doesn't matter. Very basic rules. And what you see is that DKEFS pulls a lot for problems with cognitive control in terms of self-monitoring, problems with repetition, problem following rules, and also with productivity. And the NEPSY one is primarily cognitive flexibility and productivity, not so much on the self-monitoring side or the following rule side. So the test itself will create what it is that the child needs to do and keep in mind. And you have to understand the underlying processes and the automaticity of the skills, because that affects the data. So if I'm going to use a Stroop test and I want the kids to, be susceptible to the Stroop interference effect, well, they better be able to read well. You can't use the Stroop if a kid can't read well, because you won't get the Stroop effect. And you also need to consider the availability of normative data, which is why the DKEFS has been very well received, because you have a unified normative sample on a whole bunch of tests, and that's very helpful. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about this already. Deciding on what tests to use, again, assuming automaticity of the task, understanding that the brain development is continuing. So, I have this test of executive functioning, but there's only adult norms, I'm going to use it anyway. Well, that's not really appropriate. Kids have a lot of, especially younger kids, have a lot of variability in their skills. Executive functioning in the younger ages gets much better in adolescence. The variance is much smaller, so you're getting a much better, assessment of that ability there. And now back to the DKEFS. We have 9 tests. We have the trail making, verbal fluency, design fluency. Color word interference, for those of you who are not familiar with the DKEFS, is actually a Stroop test, because Stroop is, a name that's been, I don't know if it's copyrighted, but we use a different name for that. We have a card sorting test. That's a little bit different than the Wisconsin card sorting test. We have a tower, we have the word context, and 20 questions of Proverbs. We're only going to talk about a few of those because they're really the main ones that are relevant for, looking at what we're talking about today. A trail-making test has 5 conditions. You have visual scanning, number sequencing, letter sequencing, number-letter switching, and motor speed. Visual scanning is simply, can the person scan the visual field you're asking for them? If they have deficits in finding information on the page and you want to know, can they, do these things in sequence? Well, the problem could be that they just can't scan the page very well. So this is one of those sub-skills that you need to control for in order to understand if there's a problem or not. Of course, for this one, you get a total time score, how quickly they do it, omission errors, did they miss any, and commission errors, did they hit the wrong thing. Number sequencing is the next skill. It's a precursor skill. Is can they just connect numbers in their proper order? And it really measures the automaticity of that skill. If they can't do numbers in order, then you can't use the test. That's what it comes down to. You get, again, time scores and error scores for this as well. Letter sequencing, same thing. Can they put their numbers in alphabetical orders quickly? Is it an automatic skill? Again, if they're coming out with a scaled score of 1, on their ability to do this, you're not going to be able to show that they have executive functioning deficits. And somehow I got a duplicate slide in there. A letter number sequencing. This is the primary measure of executive functioning on the test. And this, in the situation, you're asking the person to switch between numbers and letters. I want you to go from 1 to A to 2, 2 to B, B to 3, and so forth till you reach the end. And that is a primary assessment of being able to switch. And it's a stimulus-bound. It occurs at the stimulus level, and there's different kinds of switching. There's ideational switching, where you have to, mentally go back and forth between ideas or concepts, and then there's stimulus based switching, which is, okay, once I see this stimulus, I need to know that I need to go to the next type of stimulus or a different kind of stimulus. I can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. So there's some attentional factors there in terms of attending to the stimuli, as well as some cognitive flexibility going on. So you have multiple cognitive factors involved in the task. There's a time scored. Essentially the understanding is that people who do this very slowly are not very good at it, meaning that it takes them a long time to switch between one thing and another. We also have error scores. People who make mistakes, they go from, 1 to 2 instead of 1 to A. Okay, they didn't switch back and forth. There's a problem with switching. Okay. Or we have people who go from, A to 2, and then 2 to B, and then B to 4. It's an improper numerical sequencing. It's more of a logic problem, or an automatic skill problem than a switching or, executive function problem. So the scores are there to help you figure out what is the nature of the problem. The time says, do they have to slow down when they switch? The errors show what kind of errors should they make. Is it a switching error, meaning that they don't switch easily, it's an executive functioning problem, or is it a numerical sequencing error in that they have a problem with automaticity? Okay, talk about those. We have a sample of pediatric TBI. This is data that you don't find in the manual. This is data we had from another study, and it helps inform us as to what kind of results we might anticipate when we're, evaluating children who have had a moderate or severe brain injury. This group had clear indication of a moderate to severe injury. Some had closed injury, some had open, so there's going to be some variability there. But in order to get a decent sample size, we had to combine those. Their injury was not due to some medical illness, but due to some kind of trauma. And they had no history of a psychiatric or intellectual impairment prior to the injury. So this is a fairly clean group. It's not necessarily going to be the kids that you're going to see. The kids that you're going to see are probably going to be really messy. They're going to have a history of learning disorder. They're going to have a history of maybe psychiatric or psychological problems and maybe behavior problems. But, there are instances when you get a nice clean group. And in this case, it helps us identify, what deficits we might see. The demographics, so primarily a white sample, mostly at least some college, and many had a college degree or higher, the parents. So you're seeing that this is a higher functioning group at the premorbid level, and the controls are matched pretty closely, almost, pretty close to identical. But if you look at their intellectual ability in terms of tests that tend not to be highly influenced by the brain injury, like BCI and PRI, they're matched very well. Now, one could argue that these scores in the TBI group are actually lower than they were premorbidly, and I would agree with that. They're probably down some points on BCI and PRI and TBI, or an FSIQ. But in order to control for these general impairments, we did match the controls on both demographics and ability level. If we look at their trail-making results, what do you see? You get this weird result where the controls are also not doing very well in visual scanning. Sometimes you get that in research. It's just, an artifact of sampling. But you see big differences on number sequencing, very big differences on letter sequencing, very big differences on number-letter sequencing, not so much on errors in number-letter or on motor speed. So, what do we make of that? They're actually worse on letter sequencing than they are on the switching, the number-letter sequencing. How can we tell if they have executive function problems in this scenario? Well, we had already said earlier in this that processing speed, especially involving any kind of cognition, is going to be very sensitive to brain injury, and that's what we're picking up here in the letter sequencing. That's something that's really highly automatic in normal, healthy children. So if you're even slow a little bit, you're going to look really impaired. Whereas number-letter sequencing is not an automatic task in kids. In fact, it's very difficult for kids to do. So you could slow down by a bit and still not look as impaired, and that's some of the things that you're picking up on here with this. But what we can do is we can look at this from, if we can control for the effects of the processing speed. So if we put in in letter and number speed, and we regress that out and just look at what's left over, which is really the switching component, what we see is that indeed the TBI sample, the kids with the brain injury, are still significantly lower than the control sample. So they're showing both processing speed and executive functioning deficits. So when we look at that profile, we might be tempted to say, gee, they've got, kind of low average processing speed and low average executive functioning switching. Yeah, it's just a speed problem. There's more going on to it than that. So we have to take that into consideration when we're looking at our reports. Just because the score is similar does not mean that there's not an executive functioning deficit. Now, with NEPSY, we've been able to use a technique in contrast scores where we actually could capture that. If you looked at the contrast score, you would say, oh, yes, it's lower than expected. Okay, indeed, this person probably has executive functioning problems on top of their processing speed. And on the slide you're looking at now, where it says marginal means, that would be consistent with what a contrast score would look like on NEPSY. Now, the contrast scores that you see on DKEFS were done earlier on, and they don't account for regression to the mean effects. So they're not regression-based, and therefore what you end up getting is oftentimes, if the score is the same, it says, okay, there's no problem. So I tell people that the contrast scores are interesting on the DKEFS. They're not as sophisticated or helpful sometimes as you need in order to understand the nature of the problems for any specific individual. So you might not want to use them. I can tell you something, but they're not perfect. Now, there's definitely, so this is a challenge. Because a lot of our executive functioning tests are based on speed. I can't pick up a difference here because there's so much deficit in speed. However, there is an underlying executive function problem, and that problem relates to cognitive flexibility or switching. They're not able to go back and forth between stimuli very quickly. So in situations where you're asking them to do that, switch back and forth, they're going to struggle. Okay. You don't see a lot of errors, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we're running out of time really fast, and I apologize for that. But you see they don't make a lot of errors on the easy tests, but when you get to the sequencing tasks, a lot of them make mistakes. 1 error, 2 errors, 3 errors, 4 errors on sequencing errors, or set loss errors, which is they don't switch. There's a pretty high rate of switching errors. And you'll see that 19% of the TBI kids had scores on errors that were below average in the normative sample, and 22% had that should be switching errors compared to the normative sample. So the proportion of them are not only slow, but they're also making mistakes. Some of them are sequencing error, means that they're having problems just with the quick switching back and forth and keeping track of the counting. Some are actually having switching errors, meaning that they don't switch when they're supposed to. That's an executive function problem. So you can tease that out by looking at these analyses if you're not sure if there's an executive function problem or not. Verbal fluency is a classic test in neuropsychology. Looks at behavioral productivity. Can the person produce information when you requested of them? Can they go back into their brain and fish out what they need to fish out when you ask for it? There's 3 conditions. There's letter fluency condition, the category fluency, and category switching. This is a language test. People who have language problems do poorly on it, not because of executive functions, but because they don't have the language skills. If you suspect the person has a significant language problem, you will see that they do poorly on this, not because of executive functions, but because of the language problems. Keep that in mind. Now, the letter fluency is based on, simply, I'm going to give you a letter, you tell me as many words as you can that start with that letter. So the letter F, tell me as many words as you can. Of course, kids who are, severely dysgraphic have problems with it because they can't spell. And I give you the words that begin with PH and other things that are crazy. But you can keep track of that to figure out if they're having a problem that way. It's a good measure of cognitive flexibility at the ideational level. The stimulus doesn't change, but they have to figure out, okay, what information have I gotten before? I need to get something different out. And then you have to go to a different letter. Now I don't need F's anymore, I need A's. All the words start with A. So you have to switch mentally from one concept to another. And the letter fluency is important because you typically don't store things in your brain based on what letter they start with. You usually store things categorically. So it's a more difficult task. And it's a good measure of initiation. You know, do they start well? We have scores to help you figure if that's a problem with starting. Is it a problem with maintaining effort? Is it a problem with flexibility in thinking? Is it a problem with self-monitoring? So by looking at the error scores, you can tease out what the nature of the problem is. Category fluency, this one is animals and boys' names. Tell me as many animals as you can. Doesn't matter what letter they start with. Tell me as many boys' names as you can. Boys' names not the greatest category, but it is what it is. Some people use it, you know, kids who are having social problems. If they can't name anybody's name, then you know they're having some issues. So this is another way to look at. It's another way to look at, can the person go in and get information? It's behavioral productivity, cognitive flexibility, but it's easier than letter fluency. So when the task is novel and challenging versus when the task is easy and automatized, you can compare those two to make a decision about, oh, okay, this is really an issue with novel information, or oh, this is just you know, a general problem with getting information out of, you know, long-term memory stores and access and all that kind of thing, retrieving information. You can look at, you know, do they make errors, do they lose set loss, they make repetition errors. And I want to say that on this test, errors are really unusual in both normal and clinicals. So you don't see a lot of errors on category fluency. You don't see it a lot in even FAS. So category switching is another level of ideational switching, cognitive flexibility. So you're producing to different categories, fruit, furniture, and you have to go back and forth. You have to mentally keep track to switch, though. There's no cue. There's no visual cue saying, oh, do something different, do something different. In your mind, you have to know that, oh, I just said fruit. Now I have to switch to a furniture, and I have to go back and forth. So it's all, can you regulate that switching or flexibility in your mind rather than having something right in your face telling you, okay, now it's time to do something different. Can you do it on your own? And this you can compare to the category fluency in general to figure out, you know, gee, is it a switching problem or is it a problem with just all category fluency, which is, you know, a problem with semantic processing in general. What do we see in our clinical groups? We see the significantly lower in both letter fluency, category fluency, category switching, not a significant difference for switching accuracy, no difference in any of the error scores. You see a little bit, you know, they do a little bit worse on repetitions, but that's not statistically different. If you were to put all of these in, you know, one equation, you know, it would look like there's no difference between the groups, but there clearly are in terms of letter fluency and category fluency. Now, the thing is that you might look at that and say, well, the letter fluency is lower than category fluency, so do they have more trouble with the letter fluency, which is the novel or the, you know, unexpected way of looking for information than the semantic? You know, then then you would say, okay, you know, it's an issue with novelty as well as access. And here we see that it is not. In case they're about the same. And in fact, the category and the category switching also are not statistically different from one another. So it's really just a whole productivity. They have problems accessing that information. Is it subtle language problems? Possibly, but not necessarily so. We know that the subtle language problems they have are actually more related to the pragmatic skills and more complex communication rather than basic semantic knowledge. Design fluency is actually one of my favorite tests as a clinician. I use it all the time because it gave me a great sense of the amount of effort that a child would put into a task that was completely meaningless and not very interesting to do in and of itself compared to their ability to actualize that performance, to make it a good performance, to make it accurate, make it meaningful. Again, this is a visual perceptual test. If you have kids with severe visual perceptual problems, it's not going to be a very good measure of executive functioning. The field dot condition, of course, they have to generate as many novel designs as possible. So you got productivity, you have cognitive flexibility at the ideational level, you have initiation and maintaining effort, as well as ability to maintain set. There's a lot of rules. Use only 4 lines, connect only filled dots, make sure a line touches another at a dot, and don't repeat designs. So to keep all that in mind while they're doing it. And this is a test that you'll see a lot of errors in. In clinicals, you'll see a lot of errors. Even in normal healthy controls, you'll see some people get errors, and that's because it's hard to keep track of that over time, all those ones. The empty dot is in contrast to the filled dot, so you have both filled dots and empty dots on the page, and they have to ignore the stimuli, which is the filled circles. They only connect empty dots. So it's another rule. Don't touch a filled dot. So they have another rule to follow. And then switching dots, which tends to be the most sensitive to clinical conditions, which adds the element of switching. And this is switching at the stimulus level. Okay, I see a dark one, I have to go to a light one. The light one, I have to go to a dark one. But it also is in your mind in that, I have to keep in mind, I have to think about the fact that I have to go back and forth between these two. So it's primarily a stimulus level, but there is some ideational in terms of the switching or the cognitive flexibility. Okay, so you get scores for all 3 conditions, total for just switching, total attempted. This is a really nice, I really like this. It's the amount of designs that they produce. So if you have a kid, they say, he doesn't try very hard. He's giving me 30 designs, and he's trying really hard. His accuracy was only 50%, which means he broke all the rules and couldn't pay attention to what he was doing, but hey, he was at least trying. So their accuracy score tells you how well they actualized, and it's a nice contrast, attempted versus accuracy. The set loss, what was the nature of the problem? Was it because they couldn't follow the rules, or repetitions where they couldn't keep track of what they had already done something? Actually, repeated there. In our results in our clinical sample, we see that there's a significant difference for the empty dots and a significant difference in the switching and the total. There were no specific differences in repetitions or attempted, but the overall accuracy was lower, which tells me that in the clinical group, they're just making a couple of errors in repetitions and a couple errors in a couple errors in set loss, and that's adding up in their total accuracy. They're trying really hard. They have good SEM scores, but they're not actualizing very well. And they don't have total deficits, meaning that they could do the filled dots, but when you start adding an interference condition now they have another rule to follow, they start to get worse. When you ask them to switch back and forth, you add the switching on top of that, they get worse than that. So the more rules and the more demands that you put on these kids, the more likely they are to have problems and to not be able to actualize their effort. They're trying hard, but they just can't get it done. If you think about that, and oftentimes I'll relate this, and if you look at a kid's writing sample, you'll see a lot the same thing. They'll score really high on, the amount of information they yield, how much they produce, yet their spelling's off, their grammar's off, all these things that they have problems with. They produce a lot, it's just not of really high quality. Math test, they get through the math test, they get through it just fine in terms of they complete all the items, but when you go back, you look, they made a lot of mistakes. And when we look at controlling for that, do they have a specific problem with switching? Their switching, was not necessarily any worse than any of the other ones, but they did show a pretty significant deficit in accuracy compared to the total score that they produced. So their accuracy was even worse than their total score. And if you had contrast scores for that, they would come out to about a 7.6, which is, is actually not very good. So they have problems with cognitive flexibility. They have problems with, employing the rules of the task and maintaining set. And because we see as we added rules, their performance got worse, and they tend to have lower accuracy in general. Now, the color word interference test is color naming, which you just name the color of a patch that you see on the screen, on the page. Word reading, you read a word, red, blue, or green. The interference is you see the word red in the color blue, and you have to say blue instead of reading the word red. Interference switching, whenever you see the word in a box, you have to do the opposite of what you were doing before, which was instead of inhibiting the reading, you actually do read the word. Again, this is a language and reading-based test, and sometimes what you'll see is that in linguistic minorities, if you have a kid who's either bilingual or maybe is more comfortable in, say, Spanish or something, they won't show strong Stroop effects because the reading to them in English isn't automatic, and you have to have automatic reading to get Stroop effect. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, color naming, we talked about it already. Just rapidly identify the ink color. You measure speed and errors. And everything we do, we measure speed and errors. Anything you look at on NEPSY, in terms of executive function, if there's speed, there's errors, because you can't tell how good a performance is with just speed alone. Someone can be very fast at something and very terrible at it. So you need to have both. Okay, word reading. This is where you see if the kid can read well enough to do the test. If they're, if you get a scaled score of 4 on word reading, how are they going to do much worse on the interference condition? Their reading isn't automatic enough in order to differentiate them. The inhibitory control, can they inhibit the prepotent or automatic response, which is to read the word, to do something different, and that's to read the color of the ink. Of course, you have errors that are corrected or uncorrected. That tells you if the person has good self-monitoring or not, because everyone makes a mistake once in a while. So you'll be reading along quickly, and you say, blue, no, red. That's different than the person who just goes, blue, blue, and just goes through and doesn't even think about what they've done or said. So you can differentiate that using those sub-scores. And the inhibition switching, of course, is the same as the inhibition, but you sometimes just say the word. What are the results in our traumatic brain injury sample? Of course, again, look, their color naming was just so slow. Their word reading was slow. Their inhibition time was actually a little better. And their inhibition errors, though, were significantly low. Their inhibition switching time was pretty low. It was like one of their worst scores. And inhibition switching errors were also bad. So what is this telling us? They're not showing an inhibition effect on time. Okay? And it's actually much better than their color naming or their word reading. So maybe they don't have problems with inhibition. Well, yes and no. If you control for their word reading and color naming, in fact, they don't show any deficits on the inhibition task in and of itself. So they're not showing a primary deficit in inhibition beyond the processing speed problem. And that's, again, it's hard to get over that basic problem with speed. It's hard to show that there are other deficits. However, at least in this group, we did see a pretty big difference with switching. And is there a significant difference controlling for color naming and inhibition and word reading? No, there really is not a statistical difference. But if we go back and look at that, at the actual scores, this is one of their lowest scores. So it's a combination of factors, really. So they have this really big problem with speed, and that just gets magnified when you start looking at the switching component. So it's not the inhibition in and of itself, it's the going back and forth. And we saw that they had subtle switching problems on trails, so we have some consistency there. Switching problems on trails, switching problems here in inhibition. They have problems with the switching trial on the design fluency. They have problems with the switching trial on category fluency. So there's some consistent problems with cognitive flexibility that we're picking up. We're having some difficulty because they have so much problems with processing speed and showing it statistically. They do have, notice that they had a pretty high rate of errors, that they had errors on a lot of subtests. So they were pretty much going fast as they could and still were not in good control. The card sorting test, what I want to say about the card sorting test, because we only have a little bit of time here left, is that two conditions. One is free sort, and it's really a good measure of understanding if the person can do conceptual productivity. Can they understand different categories and other concepts? Can they create a whole bunch of different concepts around one set of stimuli? And the most sensitive part of the test is not the free sort. So they do not necessarily a normal amount. I mean, they're the same as kids with similar ability level, but they do, in fact, are able to do the free sorting pretty well. And where they really have a problem, and I've seen this a lot clinically, is with the recognition. And I want to talk about that. So the recognition trial is, okay, first you give them the free sort, and they sort the cards into as many categories as they can, and they have to explain why they sort them that way. Okay, they're the same color. Oh, these are all means of transportation. Oh, these are all, have capital letters or small letters or whatever the category happens to be. Then you, as the examiner, says, okay, now I'm going to sort the cards, and you have to figure out how I sorted them. They have big problems with that. So they can reason through their own behavior, but they can't look at what you did and say, oh, I see exactly. They'll even miss the ones that they said before. So if they sorted by color before and you sort by color, what you end up getting is some weird response. Well, these two are animals, and this is means of transportation, and this is a one's animal, these are two changes. And then they come up with these really weird things. And what they don't do is they don't say, I don't know. They won't say, well, I just don't know what you did. They'll give you a response. So they're trying again. They're trying really hard. They want to please you, but they just give you the wrong response. So I find that very fascinating. And I've seen it not just with kids with brain injury, but a lot of kids with significant developmental problems. They'll do the same thing. They're kind of okay. You'll see here they're kind of, their scores around 8 and 8.6, on the free sort condition. And then the recognition description, they're down at 7. And this is statistically worse than their free sort description. You'll see this total no, don't know is 12.5. That means it's good. It means they don't say that. They don't say, I don't know. That's very good. They, like normal kids have average, they'll say, I don't know a couple times. They won't say, I don't know. What they'll do is they'll give you an incorrect response, and that's where you see the sort recognition incorrect.
Hi, Dr. Holdnack. We have a question. Can you give some specifics as to intracranial pressure and short and long-term outcome? And the example is how high ICP makes for bad outcome.
Oh, personally, I couldn't give you any values in pressure, but I mean all the research points to as the intracranial pressure increases and they can't regulate it. The problem is it's not just having the high pressure, but it's how long that the pressure is elevated. What do they have to do to relieve it? Do they have to shunt? Do they have to do something to control that? And so it's very important. It's something that really has to be watched closely. I don't personally have any specific values as to say, okay, this is going to result in a certain outcome. And again, there's also, variability there. So someone could have this high pressure and still have okay outcomes because their premorbid level was very high or very good, or they have a real supportive family. So there's no way to say one variable is going to predict outcome completely, but it can tell you, okay, we might be more concerned because they had prolonged period of high pressure.
Is there any increase in IQ discrepancy indices related to TBI? What is the status of research on this?
I'm assuming you mean, are there differences between, BCI and PRI or like measures on other tests? And I think what you'll consistently see at the group level is that processing speed will be significantly lower than BCI and PRI in many cases. Working memory is oftentimes in between. Now, Jacques Donders has done some research, and you want to look up Jacques Donders, too, because he's done a lot of good research with memory in TBI and done some good papers with the Wechsler scales. He will say that there will not be a consistent finding of lower processing speed in kids with brain injury, that you won't find it consistently, although most of the research with the Wechsler scales, you will see at the group level, you will see that they will be lower on that scale. The other thing is if we had measures of premorbid IQ for kids, you would see discrepancies there. The other discrepancy that you will see oftentimes is if you're giving something like a children's memory scale, that verbal memory indexes, particularly delayed memory indexes, will be lower than BCI and PRI. Now, in the WAIS and the WIMS, we have a very nice way of looking at that with specific contrast scores We don't have that right now for the CMS and the WISC, but hopefully in the near future, when revisions of these tests would come out again, we would have a similar process.
And what about a child who does not seem to be responding effectively to emotional content? Can this be an EF deficit? The child had an open TBI secondary to a motorcycle accident and was in a coma for about a week.
Oh. Yeah, it's a pretty significant injury, and I'm not sure exactly what you mean, not responding to emotional stimuli. I don't know, does it mean they're not, showing empathy or warmth or those things like that, or if they're not picking up on social cues, like they're talking too much when they should stop talking, or they're not talking at all. But one of the things that the research is clearly stating, and more of this is coming out, is that aspects of social cognition, theory of mind, affect recognition, pragmatic language, maybe even prosody, are impacted by brain injury. Not having those basic social perceptual skills will have an impact on social relatedness. Maybe not to the degree you see in, an ASD, but certainly will have some decrement in their ability to do that. And, in our adult sample, when we looked at traumatic brain injury with the WAIS-WIMD and advanced clinical solutions, their worst score was not on executive functioning, it was on social perception. Then their next lowest scores are pretty much executive functioning and memory. And then IQ and processing speed, then some of the IQ measures. So the deficits you're seeing, one, they don't process information very quickly, so it's hard for them in real time interacting with people to stay on and and understand what's going on in a very quick, rapid interpersonal relationship. Two, their executive control is not that great, so they may not be attending the social rules. They might not be inhibiting things. They might be saying things that they shouldn't say, and they're not picking up on some of the social cues. Maybe I'm standing too close, or I'm talking too loud, or I'm making people feel uncomfortable, and I'm not picking up on that. So there are probably multiple factors going on there, and which is why doing a more of a comprehensive assessment can help you tease out some of those issues.
Okay, and what are some of the differences in performance outcomes between ABI and TBI survivors?
Sorry, ADI?
A is in apple, B is in boy, I, and TBI survivors.
I'm not sure what ABI, what they're referring to. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Acquired brain injury?
Acquired brain injury and TBI, I would classify them, it depends on how they got the brain injury. I mean, TBI is an acquired brain injury, so it's just one form of acquired brain injury.
They got it from a stroke.
They got it from a stroke. Okay.
Yes.
Well, so stroke can be more localized, but it depends on what age the child had the stroke, because if you have a stroke when you're younger, sometimes you get neural reorganization and areas of the brain that would have handled, say, language functioning take over when they normally wouldn't have done that. So you'll see deficits in maybe an area that you don't expect based upon how there's the reorganization. But if you have an older kid, if you had a kid who's 13 or 14, has a lot of skills established, you'll see very similar syndromes, stroke syndromes in that age group as you see in adults. So if it's a left frontal, you're going to get aphasia. You might get some motor weaknesses contralateral to where the stroke is, and whereas with a head injury, you tend to get less focal signs. You might get some focal signs initially, but what you get is more diffuse injury because the brain has it turns, it spins, and it bounces around, so you get shearing, you get damage at the location, plus at contra coup. And then you get the after effects of the brain injury, and the brain gets cytotoxic, and you start having damage due to that, so you'll get memory problems and all those kind of things. So the profile is really, can be very different. But if could be the same if you have a massive stroke, and in that case you're going to have a lot of problems. But so it really depends. I mean, there's not really a one-to-one correspondence because the outcomes at TBI are very variable depending upon the nature of the injury.
If someone invested in the DKEF and NEPSY, could you compare contrast the benefit so as to choose which battery to use for an adolescent?
you got some overlap in construct and you have some differences in construct. The overlap you'll see, say, like with the card sorting test. The card sorting test on NEPSY is actually easier to give, and it doesn't have as many verbal influences because you don't describe what it is that how you've sorted them. DKEFS allows you to dig a little deeper and to understand why the person is thinking the way they're thinking, and they have the recognition trial, which I think is a little more sensitive. And even in my slides here, if you look through them, I don't know if we've sent copies or not, but you'll see that on the NEPSY card sort. It's not quite. It functions a lot like just the free sort on the DKEFS. But the advantage is that you can tend to go a little lower with the NEPSY versions of things, so that goes down to 7 instead of 8. And honestly, with the DKEFS, I kind of start around age 10 with DKEFS, only because you get some floor issues on some of the tests. So you would need to look at, okay, I'm testing adolescents. A good proportion of the time, I'll probably be doing some of the DKEFS and maybe some of the things from NEPSY, like the attention measure from NEPSY. That's a good one. We don't have that on DKEFS. The other thing is the interference condition on working memory. You don't see that too many places. So you have the working memory with interference, which is a really nice integration of working memory and executive functioning. That's real nice for adolescents. You also, of course, with NEPSY, you get some social perception, theory of mind, and affect recognition that you don't get on DKEFS. But if I were to go test by test and say design fluency on DKEFS versus the design fluency on NEPSY, young kid, I'm using NEPSY. Kid over the age of, say starting around 10, I'm using DKEFS if they're not real low functioning. If I have a real low functioning kid, I just don't think they'll handle the DKEFS version. Verbal fluency, kind of the same way. Younger kid, I'm going to use NEPSY. Adolescent, I'll probably use DKEFS.